Hello friends, for today's video I'm going to be doing a self-published fantasy wrap-up, and I'm going to structure this very similar to how I do my new fantasy releases wrap-ups. And if you are new, the way I do those is every time I've read 3 new fantasy releases, I will do a video where I discuss those. I'll have timestamps in case you're only curious about one of those books or if you'd like to reference back to any of them. And then if you think any of them sound interesting, I have information about them in the description bar below. And I wanted to do something very similar for self-published fantasy books to ensure that they really get more attention and that they get highlighted a little bit, because typically we're very familiar with traditionally published works, but we're less familiar with self-pub fantasy. And so I just wanted to ensure there was a space where these could shine. The 3 books that we're going to be talking about today would be Rise of the Ranger, Ascendant, and then The Endless War. I have talked about Rise of the Ranger in a wrap-up, so you might have heard me discuss it already. And if that is the case, you can go ahead and skip ahead, as I am going to start with this one. And Rise of the Ranger is part of an epic fantasy series. It's just the first one in that series. I definitely feel like that first book barely scratched the surface, which is not to say that I wasn't compelled or I feel like it's gonna be a while before I care about what's transpiring. I still cared. I was still very invested. I just feel like there's so much more to discover. I was hoping to have been able to have picked up some sequels by this point. I haven't yet had the chance, but I will definitely be continuing with this series. The setup is that it has this really explosive opening where something detrimental is occurring to this particular area, and a young boy is tasked with fleeing, and as he is doing so, he is given something that seems to be of value. And then, oddly, he looks back at some point, and it seems as though the place he fled isn't what it was seconds before. A man comes upon him, finds him, and basically it is established that this place that he was just at, that place was destroyed years and years ago. So you gather, okay, something's going on. There's some kind of portal or time travel or something. I don't really know what it is. It's a very gripping opening. And then from there, you start to explore a lot of different perspectives, one of which is the boy who is now a man, and you are kind of trying to fill in the gaps of what's happened in his life since that point. And that was what really pulled me in, because I liked this character quite a bit. And you do get a wide range of perspectives, but his was always the one I wanted to know more about. I think it is difficult to have a character start out as a child, then jump to an adult, and then even though them as an adult, they are a part of the story and the plot is moving forward, for you to still be like, yeah, but I want to know what happened in between. I think that's kind of hard to accomplish, and I think the author did a really great job of that. And then as far as the rest of the world, so much of it is pulling from things we've seen in classic fantasy before. You have elves. They aren't necessarily breaking out of the typical norms that we see for elves. They're generally very beautiful. They live longer lives. They maybe have certain views towards humans. They kind of think very highly of themselves. So you have those sorts of things established. There are talks about the lore with dragons, so I feel like a lot of the book I'm like, when are we gonna see some dragons? And you have a lot of other factions that are playing against each other. There is also a magic school setting. It's not something you explore the same way you do in a book dedicated to going through that magic school, but I feel like we got glimpses of this basically magic university, and I was like, man, I could just sit in this place. I feel like the author really established each of the environments and settings really well, and then had the pieces slowly start to come together and then fracture apart. And that's where I'm left, where I'm just like, I want to know so much more about this world. And there is so much to the political maneuverings, the way in which people are vying for power, being introduced to a group and wondering, are they going to be a monumental player, or are they just going to eat it pretty soon? And you don't know, and it's kind of edge of your seat. And I think what this does well is it does take a lot of the blueprints that we've seen pulled from before with fantasy, but it's doing something with that feels unique and original. So in some ways it feels like coming home. It feels like classic fantasy, but at the same time it feels like classic fantasy with a more modern voice and with a plot that I'm very invested in. So if you haven't checked out Rise of the Ranger, I would say give this first book a go, and then maybe by the time I get around to the sequels, you'll have already surpassed me and you'll have completed the series. I'm really excited that there's so many more books because it is epic fantasy. Sometimes I'll pick up the first entry in an epic fantasy series and it turns out it's just going to be a trilogy, and I'm like, how can we get enough in just 3 books? So it actually makes me really excited that this series is quite long. Anyway, moving on now to The Endless War, because this is a pretty drastically different story than the one we were just talking about. The previous one, there's a lot of magic, there's a lot of mythical creatures and beings, and The Endless War, there's essentially none of that. There is actually basically no magic in this series, or at the very least we have yet to see any magic. Occasionally people will reference the stars and prophecies, or certain people will be referred to as witches. But I think it's more of just like, oh, I think that person might be a witch. The same way we kind of in our own world would throw that word around in the past and use it in sort of a negative sense. It feels like that. We don't really see any magic. And I have described it before. If you don't know, this is part of the Bridge Kingdom series, which is made up of a collection of duologies. The first 2 deal with the characters Lara and Arin, and then this duology is looking at Karis and Zara. This is the second book in the second duology, so I can't say too much about the plot itself, but I will mention the plot of the first of this duology, and then that way you have an idea of what you're getting into with it. You would probably want to start with the first of the Bridge Kingdom, which is just called the Bridge Kingdom, as the way in which the author kind of overlaps the end of the first duology with the beginning of this one is actually pretty interesting, and I've not really approached a series done like that before. I think you will see oftentimes series that are pretty chronological, and then you follow, you have series of standalones where you'll have a standalone, it tells a story, a character's introduced. Okay, now we're looking at that character in this standalone. But to have one series of duologies is already kind of different, but then to have overlap where the second book and the third book kind of happen somewhat simultaneously is interesting, because you're like, okay, I saw those characters, I am interested in them, now we're gonna open the door and see what was going on with them that entire time. It's kind of like in the Marvel Cinematic Universe when everybody's like, where was Ant-Man this whole time? That whole thing when there's a certain point in Marvel. I don't even know where we are anymore because I don't care. Zero in on Karis and Zara. We get to know these characters, and you actually see them before the events of that second book, and then as we push through book 3 is where it starts to overlap with where the events of book 2 occurred. And then we kind of come out of that, and then this is finally new terrain that we've yet to explore. And the setup is that you have these 2 characters that are from rival countries, and one of them is the heir to the throne, and the other is a very powerful warrior who has a lot of political sway as well. However, due to where they're currently stationed and how they're choosing to navigate this particular area they're in, they're somewhat keeping their identities a secret. It's not unclear which side they're on, but the extent of their status is what they're keeping a secret. And they happen to cross paths, and they sort of develop a friendship with one another that leads to more. And then eventually there's these revelations of who is who, and that's where everything starts to have a lot of pressure put onto it. So it really is a kind of almost like forbidden love trope, as well as enemies to lovers trope. So those 2 things combined. And you see these characters fighting for their principles. They want the war that's occurring to end. They do think a lot of the people that are in power, the decisions they make are corrupt or are morally wrong, and they want to do something about that. But they still have a lot of the things instilled in them from their individual countries that do make them question and butt heads, and more than that, it makes them fight at times and really wonder who's right. And they have loyalties to each other, then loyalties to their own countries, and those things clash at times. I'm sure it's clear at this point, but if it's not, this is a fantasy romance series. And I have said of the series as a whole that I think it balances the plot and the romantic aspects quite well. I think a common complaint a lot of us have is that books that have such a heavy emphasis on romantic subplots, it's hard to take them seriously when you have supposedly these characters caring very much about their homeland, the security of their people, they care about the safety of their loved ones. The world is literally on the brink of destruction, and yet they're like, oh, but also I want this person, and all of that stuff goes out the window, and you're like, it's hard. It just is hard to get invested when it doesn't feel like even they're that invested in these important things. It makes the important things feel like a backdrop as opposed to a well fleshed out and realized world and character. So I have always thought that this series balanced those things, where you have the plot and it motivates the characters, their plot lines are actually going somewhere, and yet they have human emotions and feelings and reactions to this person that they are attracted to. I feel like it's balanced it really well. I thought the third one balanced it the least, which would be the first in this duology. The Inadequate Heir is the name of that book, so I'll call it that so that hopefully it's clearer. I thought the Inadequate Heir balanced that not as well as the previous books. I thought this one, interestingly, went the most in the other direction, where it was the most plot-centric and the least to do with pausing all of the important world-shattering events so that we can be together for a little while. I feel like really put a pause on that. And if anything, I was like, it feels like the plot is so happening right now that we want to kind of just fast forward through this stuff so we can get back to this stuff, which I'm not opposed to. It might be a negative for some people. Also, that was just my opinion, so you might disagree if you pick the series up anyway. But I was kind of excited about that because the plot, there is a lot of politics. I said before, there's not really magic in this world. The fantastical elements come purely from the fact that it is a different world and that they have different political things they have to deal with. The politics also comes into play with the geography, the terrain, trade, all of those things. So it does feel like a well-realized world. Anyway, so I was really excited because I felt like, okay, well, now this character is trying to have these characters be their allies, and then they have these other people at home that are, it would seem, trying to scheme against them. There's all these pressures against them, but also they really want to rescue this person they care about, and so how are we gonna do all these things at once? And then the other character is thinking, I care about my people. My people are more important than what's important to me, but also it still hurts that I might have to give up this person that I care about. And so it ended up feeling way more, I liked these characters more. I really found myself being like, I want them to be together. I want there to be a pause. I want there to be a break in all the chaos so that they can find time for each other. And I feel like it's never that. It feels like it's always the opposite. So I really appreciated that about this book. If you're somebody who's all about this over here, the romantic, I just want them to smooch for most of the book, then maybe that's a downside for you. But I did really appreciate the plot, and I was a little concerned because Inadequate Heir for me was in third place, I would say, for the Bridge Kingdom series as a whole, but this book I think brought the second duology up, in my opinion. I quite liked it. I also want to highlight that it moved really fast. I flew through it, and there would be times that the chapters are very short, so there'd be times where I'm like, okay, one more chapter. And then I'd be like, well, I mean, that was like 3 pages, so I guess another chapter. And I would just keep going, and then I was basically done with the book in a very short amount of time. So it moves. I think the author has a way of making it feel like every moment is high stakes, even when if you were to step back, you're like, it's not that high stakes. But it's not that it feels dramatized. It just feels like you are on the edge of your seat constantly, which I really liked. I am excited because I know that she is going to be eventually writing a book that is going to follow another character, so I'm excited for when that happens, because I do really enjoy this as far as fantasy romance goes. I think fantasy readers coming to fantasy romance, a lot of us have a hard time finding a series that really works for us, and thus far I feel like the Bridge Kingdom series, it is a good balance, and I quite like it, especially if you're a political fantasy fan, because that's primarily, like I said, where the fantasy elements come into the picture. Now for Ascendant. This is the first book in the Songs of Chaos, and I loved this. I loved this so much, primarily because it is the classic A Boy and His Dragon, and the dragon is so cute. I have stated many a time that if there's a TV show or a video game or a book that has any kind of animal companion or mythological creature companion, that character is gonna be my favorite, more than likely, because I like animals in a very general sense more than people. You know what I mean? Like, I don't literally, but also I'm just like, ugh, but they don't irritate me. They don't make me mad. They're just sweet little innocents. They're precious. This, for me, is the easiest to recommend. I think the first two, I think Rise of the Ranger is a lot to ask of a person because it is epic fantasy. And so for me anyway, if I'm getting into an epic fantasy series, I very much feel like, okay, I have to really take my time. I have to try to keep track of who's who, what their goals are, what their motivations are. Also the lore, the hints of the lore they're giving us. I have to really make sure I'm keeping that and I'm storing that somewhere because it's going to come back. And it's kind of an undertaking, which I know a lot of us love. Then you have things like the Bridge Kingdom series, which is less of those things, and it is more character focused, character relationship building. However, a lot of people, they want less of an emphasis on the romantic plot lines, and so even if they're balanced pretty well, they prefer that those things always remain subplots. And I understand that everybody has their own unique taste, so those ones are a little bit more specific, whereas this one, I feel like if you like fantasy, pick this book up. It doesn't matter your age, it doesn't matter what you typically gravitate towards, because this one just has so much that I think so many of us love, and I think it has a lot of things that made us fall in love with fantasy. The setup for the story is that you follow a young boy named Holt who's on the cusp of manhood, and he is a cook. It is established that if you have previous generations that have a certain profession, that is then what you're going to be as well. And so in being a cook, he has a very close relationship with his father. They work side by side, and he also gets to see a lot of people of higher status, and that includes the dragon riders. And he idolizes them. He thinks dragons are amazing. He kind of fantasizes about becoming a dragon rider. And the dragon riders and the order, they protect the land against the Scourge, which is this horde of undead. They're like these bug-like creatures, and they wreak havoc wherever they go. The defense against them is the Order, the Dragon Riders. So Holt sees these people as heroes, and he has the opportunity in serving them, cooking for them, to kind of from the sidelines see from a distance what life is like. And there's an opportunity for him to get to see them a little closer up, and that includes the dragon eggs, and he discovers that the dragons themselves are very brutal and harsh, and they do not tolerate weaknesses in their own kind. So they can sense when there are eggs that are going to result in a dragon hatching that has a weakness to them, and it, he discovers, is deemed appropriate to be rid of those eggs, to destroy them before they hatch. And Holt just finds his heart breaking at the idea of a small little dragon baby not being able to live because it is deemed too weak. So he ends up stealing an egg, and then he doesn't really think through what's going to come next, but the egg is going to hatch, and he will now have to find himself responsible for taking care of a dragon, and a dragon that has some differences between it and the other dragons. And the dragon in this, whose name is Ash, that's what he names him, is so cute. And when I think about what happens in this book, there are some big scenes, there's some big moments, but it's not like a tremendous amount of time passes. It wasn't the biggest of page turners as far as there's always a threat. We have to constantly keep turning the page. I wouldn't say it has the pacing like what I was describing with The Endless War, where it feels like everything is high stakes all the time, but rather it had moments of just Holt and Ash and getting to know each other and trying to understand how to help this little dragon and trying to take what he knows of dragons and apply it to this dragon, but this dragon's different, so maybe not everything is as it seems anyway, and he's trying to learn. And it's like getting a puppy and trying to train a puppy and be there for a puppy, and except for it's a dragon, and you're like, oh, they're so cute. So I didn't mind at all that a lot of time was dedicated to the relationship building between the boy and his dragon. If you're gonna give me a boy and his dragon type of story, I want to see the boy and his dragon actually have a relationship build, and this one took the time to do that, which does mean the beginning is a little bit slower going, but I did not care at all, because to me, I don't need to have the fast-paced, explosive moments from page one. I like to sort of build into something, because then it establishes the relationships between the characters themselves. It establishes the stakes early on so that when things happen later, they're more impactful. And I felt like this book did that really, really well. I loved the dragon in this. I do think that in a lot of ways, this book transcends age range. I would recommend it to middle grade readers, young adult readers, and adult readers, as I think there's enough lore with the world and the way in which the magic works with the dragons itself. I think that's very appealing to adult fantasy readers. The YA and middle grade, I think it's this coming of age story, trying to find your place, and also there just being this sort of classic fantasy feel. I think a lot of us read Aragon when we were younger. This feels like the new version of that. I liked this so much. The magic with the dragons is really cool in that each of the dragons has almost like different classes that they can fall into, and depending on which one they're in, they have different powers, and those powers kind of they manifest within their cores. And the dragon riders, what they can do is they can help purify those cores and then make them stronger. The relationship, they can kind of pull magic from that, and then they themselves have access to magic, and there's almost different tiers depending on the core itself, and they can kind of, the way that the magic is absorbed, for example, if there's a fire dragon, we'll call them, so they can sort of take in magic that has fire, but they pull in other things as well that they can't really use. So I'm going to throw out an example of like earth. They can't really use that, so the dragon rider, through their bond, can kind of push that out. And there's certain things to the bond that have associations with rhythm, hence why it's called Songs of Chaos, because there's this magical element that has to do with music as well, which I really think is quite cool. As a musician, I really enjoyed that element to it. So in general, I just thought there was enough there that is going to be really exciting to explore if you are somebody who typically likes adult fantasy. Of course, that's not to say that that doesn't exist in middle grade and adult, but just in general, middle grade and young adult. But just in general, I think typically we associate more of that in-depth magic and world building. We think of adult fantasy with that. And then just sort of this coming of age story, I think, is very common in young adult and middle grade. So I think a lot of younger readers are going to find this very appealing. Who doesn't love the boy and his dragon type of story? I think the downside is it maybe, while I think it certainly has uniqueness in its plot and in, like I was describing, the magic, I do think that the foundation itself is obviously not the most original. There's a reason I can say this is a boy and his dragon story, and we all know what that means. So if you're somebody who's like, I love Joe Abercrombie because he defies fantasy expectations, he flips tropes on their head, if that's your thing, this maybe isn't as much going to be appealing to you. But in general, I think there's a lot that this story has to offer. And I want to say, because of the fact that I think this could easily be read by so many different ages, something that we very rarely see in young adult fantasy is boy protagonists. And obviously, there's a lot that we could dissect about that, but I think that there's this idea that because there's so many girl protagonists in young adult, that YA is for girls, which has led to all sorts of divides within the age ranges, and then even the authors who are writing adult fantasy that are women, it's sometimes placed in YA just because of that, and there's a lot of negatives to it, but one of the negatives obviously is that there are very few boy protagonists, and when you are a young person, part of you coming into yourself, discovering yourself, knowing who you are, what you like, what you don't like, a big part of your identity when you're growing up is rooted in your gender because of how people treat you as a result of your gender. And there's certain things, of course, that I think it doesn't matter if you're a boy or a girl. There's universal things that we all experience, which is why it doesn't necessarily matter. Boys can read books with girl protagonists, girls can read books with boy protagonists, of course, but there are just certain things that you kind of want to see yourself reflected in stories. And as I said, when you're growing up, the world treats you very differently depending on your gender, and so I just think it's really important for young people to get to see themselves, and it makes me sad that there's such a lack of boys in young adult as the protagonist. So I really appreciate that that is here. And there are other characters in this that are interesting to explore, that you can kind of sense there's something to them. The main protagonist is Holt. You occasionally get a perspective from another character. It's very rare, so I would still categorize this as primarily single, even though those do slip in here and there. And then, of course, there's the occasional thing that's dropped that makes you curious about the sequels, because this is a book one. But in general, I just really enjoyed all the characters. I enjoyed Holt. I enjoyed the mentor-like character. I liked the relationship he had with his father. I liked the princess character that shows up in this and is a big part of the story. I really enjoyed her as well. And getting to know her, seeing how her and Holt develop a friendship throughout the course of the story. I just think a lot of it was done very, very well, and I think this is going to appeal to so many people, and I can't wait to read the sequels. So anyway, that's it for this self-published fantasy wrap-up. If you have your own thoughts about these, feel free to share those. And then if you have your own recommendations based off of the ones I talked about, if there are others that you think, oh, hey, if you liked these, check out these other ones, feel free to leave those recommendations. As always, I will have these linked in the description bar down below in case you'd like to check any of them out. Hope you have a great rest of your day, though. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you later. Bye.